Good morning everyone, welcome to our small footprint. You'll have to excuse the dressing gown, it's chilly out in the kitchen and I wanted to come out first thing in the morning and show you all the jars that we finished up yesterday in proper lighting because it was night time by the time I got to them. So I wanted to come out this morning and take some footage of the jars to share with you, and I haven't gotten dressed yet because it's 6 a.m. and it's chilly and nobody else is up yet, so I thought I wouldn't bother. So welcome to our small footprint. Today's video is potatoes. Thank you for joining me. We got big boxes of Kifler style potatoes in the food hamper recently, and a couple of the ladies contacted me who were also getting the hamper and asked about videos to do with canning potatoes. So we've done it a few different ways. I've dry canned them, I've canned them in stock, and I've canned them as part of a sausage and potato soup or a Zuppa Toscana soup base. So I'm going to share all of that with you and enjoy watching, and I will see you on the next video. Thanks guys. So the first thing I had to do was I had to process the pork that I had in the fridge. So yesterday I diced it up into small pieces and seasoned it and stuck it back in the fridge to handle today, and then this morning I pulled the mincer out, the KitchenAid mincer attachment out, and minced it all through. So it was around about probably 5 odd kilos of mince. I didn't actually weigh it. It was probably about 5 kilos of pork shoulder that I had cut up and marinated, and I put it through the mincer, and it took me around about 15 minutes to get it all through the mincer. This has some bacon bits in it, some cowboy candy, some general herbs and spices, paprika, pepper, salt, all the normal stuff that I put in my minced pork, and it will be used for a myriad of things as well as the canning today. So because of delays with the COVID and everything else, some of my stuff has sat in the fridge a little longer than I'd like, so these were coming up to their best before date. So by cooking it all off, it gives the pork another few days in the fridge for me to deal with, use, cook, or bag up for the freezer or whatever else. So I cooked the whole batch off as well. I also cook it off for canning purposes because if you raw pack it, it all clumps together, whereas if you've cooked it off first, it holds its shape. I then cleaned all the potatoes. I got these new nail brushes with a stainless steel handle. I really like these nail brushes, veggie brushes, whatever you want to call them. I have 2, so I use them for a myriad of things. And I gave the potatoes all a quick clean. Now, the standards for canning, the US standards for canning, are that you do not can potatoes with skin on. So a disclaimer here that I can my potatoes with the skin on. I believe that they're cleaned very well when you get them as washed potatoes, and then I scrub them in the sink as well, and then I dice them all up and I put them in a pot of water with some citric acid or lemon juice or something added to it, because that helps remove some of the starch from the potatoes and stops them from going brown in the jars, but also is another cleaning agent. So that is personal preference there as to whether you're comfortable canning them with the skin on or not. The reasons that are quoted by the American authorities for canning them without skins is that they can't test every skin on every potato, and the bacteria that's on the skins can be different depending on where it's grown and what soil it is and how it's been cleaned. So they can't give this definitive answer that it's okay because they can't do that kind of testing. So it really does depend on your comfort level. I would hate to peel these little potatoes for a start. Like, it's different if you've got these really big potatoes that are fairly easy to peel, but these little Kifler ones, you'd lose a lot of meat. There's also a lot of nutrients in that little layer just between the skin and the potato. So all that to say that we choose not to dice the potatoes, but the US standards for canning state that you should. So that is your choice there to do or not do. Once I had them all diced up, they were rinsed, and then they sat in the citric acid water until I was ready to use them. You can rinse them multiple times. Some people do it multiple times. I find that this is enough. And then I filled the jars. So I just filled the jars fairly well packed. Potatoes, because they're raw packed, they shrink a little bit when they're cooked if they're dry canned. If they're cooked in liquid, they can swell, but if they're cooked in if they're dry canned, then they will shrink a little bit. So I like to pack them nice and tight into the jars for that purpose. Shove as many little pieces in as possible. I don't like the potato any smaller than this because they're a little too fragile when you tip them out to use, but you don't want them too big either because you just can't fit enough in a jar then. I put a bit of salt in each of the jars. That's personal preference. Some people also put a little bit of butter or something in there, but butter, you're not supposed to can butter either, so that's personal preference. I don't find it necessary because I tend to put a little bit of ghee or lard in the pan when I fry them up. So I put a little bit of salt in the jars though, and put the lids on and rings. So I used the 4 jars lids again. I'm really happy with these. I haven't had a fail yet using these. They're a little more expensive, but I'm pretty happy with that they just work. So buying cheaper ones, people get fails, and then it kind of defeats the purpose. So I'm pretty happy with these, even though they're a little bit more expensive. So I got them in the canner and going, and then I got a second set of jars out as well. So I filled those jars with the potato as well. Now I've got 2 canners, so I've done 3 loads all up, 2 loads in one point and then added another one. So I filled these jars with potatoes as well, topped up with a little bit of salt, and put stock in these ones. So these ones are really great for like mashed potato. All we do is we pour them out and we steam them to warm them up, and they mash up really nicely because they're cooked in the chicken stock. And this chicken stock I made fresh this morning in the pressure cooker. So the dry can ones are really good for like frying up in a pan. You just tip them into a cast iron pan and have them as like what the Americans call home fries, I think, but just basically roasted potatoes in a cast iron pan. And then the ones that are cooked in stock are really good if you've got a soup. You can just pour the stock and the potato in to add bulk to the soup, or you can strain them and mash them and use them as mashed potato, anything like that. So because there's liquid in here, I debubbled them, stuck the debubbling tool down the side of the jars to make sure there's no excess air bubbles, and adjusted the headspace if it dropped because of the debubbling. Cleaned all the rims. Now my stock is fresh made, and I do not skim the fat off it, so I have to be careful with the rims and make sure they're nice and clean because they can get a little bit fatty. So you want to make sure those rims are nice and clean. Put the lids and the rings on and stick them in the canner as well. These also were 4 jars lids, and these are ball mason jars and a bell mason. I think it's a generic quart style jar as well. The other lot that I got going was soup. The soup with the sausage. So these are size 36 jars. They're Fowler's Picola jars, and they're about 1200 mils. I put about a cup and a half of the seasoned cooked sausage mince in the bottom of the jars. Again, we're going to talk standards versus what I do, so it's your decision which way you make it. A lot of the recipes that are DIY soups state that you can only have half the jar in solids and the rest in stock. I don't really understand that, because if you're doing a jar purely potato, then you fill the jar. If you're doing a jar purely of corn or purely of carrot, then you fill the jar. Or even purely of meat, you fill the jar. So for our purposes, I'm not going to spend the time canning soup jars that are only half full. So I fill my jars. I left a little bit of excess space because they're going in liquid, so the potatoes are going to swell a little bit. But other than that, I fill my jars. So I did about a cup and a half of mince, and then I added some caramelized onion. This is just onion I'd sliced and cooked off a little bit in the pan. You can add it raw. I just like the added flavor that the caramelizing it gives to the soup. So I caramelized the onion and put that in. It was around about, I don't know, 1/8 of a cup in each jar. Then I added chicken stock paste. So the chicken stock paste is one that I make myself with the Thermomix. I don't think I've shown it on the channel, but it's a whole lot of vegetables and chicken and salt and herbs, and it's all cooked down into a paste that is left in the freezer. And it's a little bit like those Massel stock cubes that you can buy. It's just a bouillon, but a homemade bouillon. I wanted to ask too, I have these measuring spoons and cups, and I've been on the hunt, and I keep on, whichever ones I buy, they bend on me. So if anyone has any suggestions, please give me a link of ones that you like. I then topped up the jars with the potatoes, and as I said, I left a little bit of extra room in the top of the soup jars because the potatoes will swell a little bit in the liquid, so I wanted to leave enough space there as well. And I'm a little bit lenient on the headspace of the stock as well, because my jars are all going to have a little bit of a fat cap because I haven't strained my stock. So I'm a little bit lenient on giving a little more headspace to account for that. I debubbled them all and adjusted the headspace as needed, so you want to make sure you get that debubbling tool right in there to get any air bubbles out from inside the mince and the potatoes and things like that, and then adjusted the headspace accordingly to make sure that they were all even. Now, Fowler's jars have the rubber rings, so you clean the outside edge and the top, not just the top, because the rubber rings are in contact with the outside edge. So I clean the outside edge of the jars and place the rubber rings. I then clean the outside of the rings as well, because I've just handled them and I've been handling the stock and the jars and things like that. So I like to double clean them just to make sure. Just a little bit of white vinegar and a cloth, and that's all that's needed. Then they have the reusable stainless steel lids that go on top and the reusable clips. Fowler's Vicola states that you only need one clip per jar. My clips are quite old and ratty, as you can see, and so I use two because they're quite stretched for pressure canning. For water bath canning, I'm not overly concerned, but for pressure canning, I use two. Personal preference, Fowler states you only need one. Then I put all the jars in the canner and the lid on and turned the heat on. Now, because of the Camp Chef has quite high burners, I started off about medium because you don't want to bring the pressure up too fast, because you will end up with siphoning or lids blowing or things like that. You want the temperatures to come up. Any of these jars that were hot went into hot water, and if they were cold, they went into cold water. Remember, the contents of your jar, the temperature of the contents of your jar should be the same temperature as the water that they're going in on. So the first canner had the weight jiggling on it, which means that it's up at pressure. You can see the weight rocking, and that means that it's up at 15 pounds of pressure. These are 15-pound weights for my altitude, so I set the timer for 40 minutes for the potatoes, which is what's required for quarts of potatoes, 40 minutes. I had excess stock left over because I'd made a big batch of stock, so I decided that I would fill some more jars with stock to put in a batch as well. So I just filled all the jars with stock. I don't skim it, and I strain it through a colander, but I don't strain it through a cloth, so my stock is never particularly clarified or anything like that. It doesn't worry me because we pour it into cooking. It's really irrelevant. So I filled the jars with that. The second canner here I was showing you, you can see that it's venting. So when you first turn the pressure on, turn the heat on, the canner will start vent. You'll get a steady stream of steam out of the vent once the canner is coming up to pressure. You want that to vent for 10 minutes before you put the weight on, so that it allows to make sure that the insides of the canner has vented all the air and it's at pressure, and then you put the weight on. With the stock jars, I cleaned the rims as normal, put lids and rings on. It's a good time when you're cleaning the rims too to double check the rims, because you're running your finger over it, so you're going to feel if there's any flaws in the rims of your jars, because if there's a flaw in the rim of your jar, then the lid may not seal properly. So that's always a good thing to do while you're doing it. All my rings look pretty ratty because they live outside and it's weather, but they work perfectly fine. I just wanted to show you one that I wouldn't use. So this one has this big divot in it. I'd say it's been stood on, or a plate's been dropped on it in a sink or something like that. So if it's got a flaw like this, I toss them. But the way my rings look is not detrimental to the canning for me, that so long as they're all in one piece and they're straight. Once the weight is jiggling on your canner, so it vented for 10 minutes, we put the weight on, and then we waited for it to come up to pressure, and you know it's at pressure when the weight starts jiggling. This it depends on which canner. One of my canners has a pressure gauge on it, so you can see that it's at 15 pounds of pressure, and one of them doesn't. But they both have 15-pound weights, so I use those rather than the pressure gauge anyway. The soup jars are 1200 mils, so the canning time for anything with meat in a quart jar is 90 minutes. But because the jar is larger than a quart jar, you need to add 20% of time onto it for canning purposes. So these will go for 108 minutes at 15 pounds of pressure. This is both canners going, so it ends up quite noisy in my kitchen, I must say, with both weights jiggling around and things like that. But both canners going on the stove, and I ended up making pizza for dinner because both my burners were in use, so that made things easier. This is the first batch of potatoes coming out of the canner. So there was a couple here that were canned in stock and the rest that were dry canned. So I pulled them all out of the canner, and then I had the stock to go in the canner afterwards. So because the canner is already at heat and pressure, and my stock jars are hot but not boiling hot, and you want 3 quarts of water in the bottom of your pot when you're doing pressure canning, that I added 2 more quarts of water to make up for any that had evaporated in the previous batch, but also to bring that temperature down just enough that I'm not going to shock the jars by placing them in there. So I cooled the water slightly with that fresh water, and then I put the stock into that jar, into that canner, and turned that one on for the whole process. Stock is 25 minutes, but I had 1 jar of potatoes in there as well, so I just canned the whole lot for 40 minutes. It wasn't going to cause any issues with the stock, so that was fine. And then I got the soup out as well. So it's dark by now, it's quite late. Got the soup out of the canner and on the bench, and this is why I took some footage in the morning so that you could see it all on the bench in proper daylight. So that was potatoes canned 3 ways and stock canned as well. Remember that the regulations for canning is that you're not supposed to can your potatoes with peel on, you're not supposed to dry can them, things like that. So you need to have a look at the regulations yourself and decide what is your preference. But this is the way I do it, and I'm comfortable with it and have been doing it like this for a couple of years and have never had any problems. So long as the jars seal correctly, stored as well as we can, and you make sure when you open them that they have a proper seal. It has to be your comfort level, though, that matters. So thank you for joining me again today, and I hope that helped, and I will see you again next time. Bye, guys.